Phyllis Oppenheim, and I'd like to welcome you all to this event of the Philoctetes Center, which is co-directed by Francis Levy and Ed Nersessian. The title of this afternoon's roundtable is Daydreaming, Night Dreaming, and Stimulus-Independent Thought. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you the moderator of this event, which is Jerome Singer. Dr. Singer holds a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and is a graduate of the William Allenson White Institute. In addition to clinical practice, he served as director of the graduate program in clinical psychology, first at CUNY, the City University of New York, and subsequently at Yale. His research areas have included laboratory, psychometric, and developmental studies of daydreaming, consciousness, and cognition, as well as personality. His books include Daydreaming, The Power of Human Imagination, and Imagery and Psychotherapy. Dr. Singer.
It's really a pleasure to be here, and also an honor to be invited to what I think is a really imaginative, great society that has developed in the last few years in New York City. Let me just quickly point out the origins of the whole study of daydreaming, night dreaming, and the stream of consciousness. A lot of this can be traced back to William James in 1890 and his book on the principles of psychology, which not only over these many years has influenced psychology research and other behavioral research, but also had a considerable influence on literature, particularly works by Virginia Woolf, Dorothy Richardson, James Joyce, especially more recently Saul Bellow and others. So we're really, in a way, we're on the fringe, on the one hand, of very systematic scientific research, and on the other, approaches to the beginnings of a lot of important modern literature. I want to quickly mention that subsequent to the work of William James, there then was Sigmund Freud, who himself developed the method of free association in psychoanalysis, although I'm willing to bet that he was influenced to some degree by William James's work also, as well as others back in many years before in Germany. And then in the 1950s and 60s, we began to see a shift in psychology from a primarily more narrow stimulus response approach to what I would call cognitive affective research on consciousness. One of the leaders in developing this was Sylvan Tompkins, but then there was just a tremendous burst of energy in the area of cognitive psychology. And then at the same period as this was happening, you began to have laboratory studies of night dream research, and I would mention especially William Dement with his focus on the dream side of the sleep cycle, which was extremely important. One of our first presenters today is John Antrobus, who, believe it or not, worked closely with Dement and literally took over his apartment and laboratory at one point.
You have to mention Charlie Fisher, too.
Yes,
the first psychoanalyst to really get involved in all of that.
Yes. I would say I was involved, and as was John, in the emergence of research methods for studying daydreams and ongoing stimulus-independent thought, or what we call SITs, or task unrelated intrusive thought, TUITs, TUITs, sort of a hint at intuition, you might say. But there has been a real burst of research in that area that has continued, and you'll hear more about that as we go along. So let me first introduce our panel. I should mention also that that we also hope to bring out some of the clinical aspects of this work as well as the more pure research side of it. And I myself have done work on the uses of imagery in psychotherapy or the uses of daydream processes. And then also representing the psychoanalysis, we have Dr. Ethel, who has been an expert on the whole area of fantasy for many years and will represent her position. I'd like to quickly give you some background on each of our presenters. John Antrobus will begin, and he is currently retired officially from City University, but still runs a neurocognitive laboratory there and continues with some of the night dream research laboratory work as well. Eric Klinger here is one of the earliest systematic investigators in the field of the stream of thought and the structure and function of fantasy. He's published important books in this area, one of them, The Structure and Function of Fantasy, a book on daydreaming, and a book which I happen to think is very, very important called Meaning and Void, which I don't know if we'll get into that, but it's a very powerful book. He is a professor at the University of Minnesota, both the Morris campus and the Minneapolis campus. Malia Mason here is perhaps more junior in terms of years. That should be apparent, but she has done what I think is very important work and a very significant article published in Science quite recently in which she has shown relationships between behavior, behavioral research on ongoing consciousness and the what might be called stimulus-independent thought, as well as the way these are reflected in the brain function. Finally, Dr. Person, I've already mentioned, has a long career. She's a professor at Columbia University School of Medicine and also closely tied in with the Psychoanalytic Institute at Columbia, and has carried on studies, one of which were represented in the book By Force of Fantasy. She's also done work on love and romantic fantasies. She'll speak for herself about this some more. So let me first turn your attention to John Antrobus to describe some of his work and some of his theories. These will be kept short because what we are looking for here is an interaction amongst the five of us, leading into opportunities for group discussion from all of you.
Okay.
John.
Jerry and I, by the way, have been working together almost 50 years. It's a long time.
Yeah.
Never had a better colleague to work with, I must say. I'm interested in how the brain-mind actually creates thought, how it creates perception. What you're doing now, you're listening to what I say. The noise that's coming out of my mouth, you're interpreting it into words and into meanings of sentences. It's a very, very complicated process. And how that same brain-mind also switches offline from time to time, even already. You've been thinking about some other things other than what I'm saying. And what is the economics of the decision to go online versus offline? And what parts of the brain actually create those offline thoughts and images in waking or in sleep and dreaming. So that's all there is to know about life as far as I'm concerned. Nothing else really matters. Brain's a very complicated place. It's 10 to the 11th power neurons, 10 to the 14th power synapses. It's beyond possibility that you and I can ever comprehend it in more than a fragmentary kind of way. And one of the things that makes it difficult for us to actually engage in this enterprise is that we use symbols and words to try to understand it. And words and symbols and categories, every last one of them is massively gross, full of error, and therefore leads to all kinds of problems in understanding. Our brain, one of its problems is it has to stick on a small little neck like this. It's not like the whales, we can't float it in the ocean. And to make it small, it's got to be very efficient and therefore it's got to summarize massive amounts of data in order for us to carry it around. So it's simplifying, simplifying, simplifying all the time. At every level, it's simplifying. And that's the only way it can really handle the amount of data that it gets. And how it does that has implications for how we have our thoughts, our perceptions, and how we have dreams and daydreams. In some sense, you can think of the brain, where I'm going to like to get to at the end, is it's a vast interpretive organ. It's made up of not only neurons, and each neuron has, say, on the average, say 1,000 connections to it. That neuron's interpreting all those connections to decide whether it's going to fire or change its state. And those neurons are in networks of neurons. Then those networks resolve into some solution. And that's an interpretation of a large set of neurons. And then those neurons are embedded in regions of the brain. And different regions of the brain then have to decide what's going on in terms of that set of neurons. And then different regions talk to each other. One of the things that happens at nighttime, they don't talk to each other the same way as they talk to each other in a waking state. So at nighttime you can have a dream, one part of the region, visual part of the region, to say V1, V2 moving up to the fusiform part of the cortex. It might identify a face or something like that. And it's a girl. But another part of the brain over there may be further down, more anterior region, may be saying, oh, yes, my brother. And they don't speak to each other in the same way that they do in a waking state. You never get somebody saying it's my brother because he's a girl. But at nighttime in REM sleep, you can. You don't make mistakes like seeing somebody's nose upside down within the visual part of the cortex. You don't get those kinds of errors. You're more likely to get errors between the meaning of something and what you see, things like that. That's just one of the things that sort of interests me. And so it's the lack of proper connectivity in REM sleep. If it's fully connected, then you'd be awake, so you wouldn't be in REM sleep. Anyway, I'd just like to give you, so ultimately I wanted to talk about attractors. Attractors are new mathematical models to think about how regions of the brain, neural networks, talk to each other. We tend to think, because of our language and all kinds of things, all kinds of theories, we tend to think and feed forward one direction kinds of models. This is the input to that, and this is the input to that. Things move in one direction. In fact, nothing moves in one direction in the brain, not even anything. Everything is a back and forth, back and forth. All connections are both ways. Parts of the visual cortex have 10 times, 11 times as many neurons going down as they have going up, and yet the theories are all going up. Unbelievable that that should happen. We've known that for 20 years. But the theories are one way, nearly always. So what happens is each region actually acts as the context for its neighbors, constraining what its neighbors can do. No region talks on its own. And this, again, is our limitations as theorists to think. We tend to think of parts of the brain as little neat packages that have high walls around them. This one does this. When it's finished, it passes it on to that one, which does that. That's just not the way the brain goes. And that's the way thinking doesn't go that way either. Each region massively constrains what the other ones do. And that's why our thoughts are as coherent as they are. And these are called attractors. It's a mathematical kind of concept that hasn't found much, not many people know about it that much in psychology, more people actually in neuroscience. Best place to find out if you want to read anything about it is probably O'Reilly's book on neural networks. If you look up Randall O'Reilly, that work in computational models is the best. Computational models, by the way, are something we can now understand the brain because because of the high-speed computer, we can actually start to simulate things that happen, because in our minds we can only work with a few variables at a time. You remember back in the old days where they gave psychologists variables in diagnosis? By the time you've got 3 variables, the clinician cannot do better than a good mathematical model. He's always doing worse. And they used to think, well, we'll get your math models and then we'll modify them, and they always did worse. Imagine working with 10 to 11th power neurons. It's not possible for us to begin to understand how those things work. You have to have computational models. No way to understand it without them. Anyway, I didn't mean to talk about that too much, but that's what's interesting for me. And it's how these networks go and how they are then related to the values of the organism. And that's where it has its tie into psychoanalysis to some extent. But these values are distributed over large regions of the brain. So we can talk about the amygdala and sort of more primitive emotions, like we used to think of the limbic system and so on. But how those things, not everything is going to be tied directly down into the amygdala. And so we learn the values of all kinds of things. Behaviorists used to call them secondary reinforcers. We use all kinds of symbolic stuff in clinical psychology, but how do you get these learned values, and how these learned values that are distributed, and they're micro values, they're not values the way we use them in our ordinary language. It's all the way down to small sets of neurons that are below your ability to sort of penetrate them with your consciousness. How those values are created is interesting, and that determines really what you think about and what you don't think about. Anyway, back 50 years ago, we had behaviorism telling us we couldn't even ask anybody what was going through our mind. And when Jerry and I first got together, the question is, you can't have a science of mind-wandering and daydreaming unless you can measure what you're talking about. You have to measure. Without measurement, you haven't got anything. So we have people telling us we should use the Rorschach, because we shouldn't ask anybody. And then, oddly enough, a few years later, here's a physiologist who wakes somebody up in the middle of the night looking at the brain in Kleitman's lab in Chicago, and he sees the eyes moving, and so he wakes him up. He says, that guy must be watching his dreams. He wakes him up, and sure enough, he's reporting vivid imagery. It took a physiologist to ask somebody what was going through their mind. It was not possible to do that in psychology in the 50s. And so we jumped in, didn't we? And one of the first things we did, we started getting ways for people to report what was actually going through their minds. So we did questionnaires, we did interviews, we did all those kinds of things too. But ultimately, we developed a technique to have somebody in, we didn't even want to have them rate their dreams from 1 to 10, how much, because we didn't trust that. So we interrupted them automatically with a machine every 15 seconds and said, throw the switch right or left. If anything went through your mind that was not a perception, anything that went through your mind that was not actually directly related to something in this room that had all the lights out, by the way, except for the little task they had to do, which was a simple visual task. So we actually got a way then to actually measure a yes or no digit for every 15 seconds, whether something went through your mind that was created out of your whatever. And that's where we began. And that led us to a big surprise that actually people were producing something practically every few seconds. You didn't have to wait for 15 seconds. We then moved the intervals down from 15 seconds down to about 5, and people were still producing thought that was not a percept. Then we realized this whole thing, we used to think it was something that would happen every 50 minutes, you'd mind wander and so on, but every fraction of a second you're off. That changed the whole way we looked at it. And all this was, by the way, was in the background. I should stop talking pretty soon, right? Where the psychoanalysts thought that all thought and mind running was a protection against sex. Then there were the socialists who felt it was all a waste of time. You were not working, and therefore it was a bad thing to do from that point of view. There were all these background ideas that we had, and Jerry came in, and the thing he wanted to do, he felt this was positive, it was healthy, it was part of how you planned your way through life. It was a way to explore what things you might do in your world, and it was sort of planful, but then eventually we moved into sort of problem generating the things that might be, which was Eric Klinger's idea, personal concerns, I think, things that mattered to you that maybe you needed to do, and then we got together on the same kind of track. But anyway, that's where we all started. So that's enough.
Thank you. I should mention that Eric is an interesting way a tie to the more clinical side of dreams and daydreams. He literally overlapped, was born in Vienna. Freud was thriving in Vienna at the time, but I don't think they ever got to meet.
No.
Okay. Go ahead.
Never set foot on back dossier. Well, first of all, let me state that you've just heard the two pioneers that originated the post-Freudian era in daydreaming thought and research. So certainly everybody owes them a great deal. What I'd like to do now is just make a few short points. I'd like to talk a little bit about what exactly do we mean when we talk about daydreaming. There's a definitional problem that we need to address. Then I want to just very briefly introduce the daydreaming area from an evolutionary standpoint, an evolutionary perspective, and then talk extremely briefly about the evidence underlying this, and also some things about the extent to which we're talking about a perfectly natural, normal phenomenon. Okay, let's then start with what exactly do we mean? Now, there are probably three kinds of definitions of daydreaming that have been used. This is oversimplifying. But one is what you've already heard mentioned, task-unrelated thought. That is, thought that isn't related to what you're doing at the moment. A second is fanciful thought. That is, thought that departs from reality in some significant way. And then a third is undirected thought. That is, thought that's spontaneous, that you didn't mean to have, that flits through your head, you don't use it, goes out the other end. So what you might call undirected thought or spontaneous thought. When we measured or tried to measure these kinds of things separately, getting people, thought sampling people, getting them to report at a beeper what was going through their heads and to rate that, we tried to assess all three of these dimensions, figuring, well, okay, people are really talking about the same thing. We should have a good deal of convergence here. But what actually happened was that we found, using factor analysis, that we had three virtually independent dimensions of thought flow. So that something could be task-related and either directed or not directed, and either fanciful or not fanciful, and so forth, all possible combinations. And so these dimensions are really quite unrelated to each other. And so what it really makes sense to do from a technical standpoint is to think in terms of those and other dimensions of thought flow and where a person's thought at that moment falls in this hyperspace of many dimensions. That would be the thing that would make the most sense, but it's cumbersome, it's hard to talk about, and people insist on talking about daydreaming, so let me define what I will mean by it. I'll mean two kinds of things, either spontaneous thought or thought that is fanciful. And so when I say daydreaming, that's shorthand for one or the other or both of those. And I'll try to indicate which one I'm talking about. Now, from the standpoint of evolution, let me just back up to the beginning of life, in a sense, if I'm not pushing the envelope too far here. What differentiates animals, and of course humans among those, from plants are many things, but let's say two important things. One is chlorophyll, but the other is goal-directedness. That is, the extent to which the organism strives for goals. Plants don't. People do. And in that sense, then, human life really is a series of goal pursuits. And that's very important because it means that everything else about evolution, and successful goal pursuit is the precondition for the survival of individuals and also for species. And what that means is that everything else in evolution must have evolved in the service of successful goal striving. Now, in order to have a goal pursuit, in order to pursue a goal, there has to be some kind of an internal representation of the goal while you're pursuing it. There has to be a prospective memory that you are pursuing the goal. And there has to be something that orients the organism, let's talk about people, that orients the person toward the things that are related to that goal in order to make an efficient pursuit of the goal possible. So we have to posit that there is an internal process that begins when you commit yourself to a goal and that ends when you've attained the goal or given up on it. That's a complicated process, the giving up. I'm not going to talk about that here. And in the meantime, there is this latent brain process. I say latent in the sense that it's not something that's constantly, consciously on your mind, but it continues to influence you even when you're not thinking about that goal. And I call that, long ago, at the very beginning of thinking about this, I called this a current concern. I'm not sure I should have called it that, but that's what I've called it. It's in print now amply, and so I'm going to stay with the concept. So current concern refers to this latent state in the brain, and what does it do? Well, it sensitizes the individual to respond to cues that are related to that goal pursuit. And that, in other words, when encountering a cue of that kind, for example, you've got a plugged up sink and you're away from home, but you happen to see a sink somewhere and it immediately reminds you that, oh, you got to get that sink unplugged. And it reminds you of that at varying levels. It's an emotional reaction. Oh gosh, yes, and got to unplug that sink. It's a cognitive reaction. It may or may not be conscious, but when conscious, then you are mobilizing your thoughts about, geez, what's the number of that plumber again, and so forth and so on. Also, it's an action response if the circumstances are opportune for acting on that goal pursued. And so if you're at a phone and you remember the plumber's number, you're likely to call the plumber. Okay? But what happens if you have the cue and you're starting to respond to it, but it's not an opportune time to do anything about it? And what I'm positing here is that what happens then is that the process unfolds, but you inhibit the action, but what you are left with is the mental part. And the emotional and the mental parts of it, the cognitive parts of it. And those are the germ of daydreams. They're germs of other thoughts too. But if this is a spontaneous kind of thing, you're not meaning to have it, it just pops into your head, qualifies as a daydream by my definition. And so I'm arguing that at least the mind-wandering part of daydreaming is just that. It is responses to cues that remind you of your goals, and you are responding as far as you can, given the circumstances, given the advisability of acting or not acting. Okay. Now, that's the nub of the idea, and how do we know this works? Well, we know it works from quite a lot of evidence that's accumulated now. I did some dichotic work back in the 70s with a lot of other people involved, and in which we demonstrated that, and there are a lot of controls involved here. I don't want to get into the details of this here, but what we demonstrated was that if you have people listen to tapes that are, as far as they know, unrelated to their anything important in their lives. These are just students brought in this case, paid to sit and listen to two narratives at the same time, one each year. And we salted these very unobtrusively with cues that are related to their goal, the individual's goal pursuits, which we had assessed at an earlier time. And what we found was that what people were paying more attention to, because we also had a measure of what track they were paying attention to, what people were paying attention to was disproportionately those passages that were related to their goals, even though maybe indirectly. They recalled those passages about twice as often. And when we stopped shortly after one of these cue passages and asked them what they were thinking about, their thoughts were related to one of those cues about twice as often as they were to other cues. So very clearly, we got a lot of control of the flow of consciousness at several different levels simply by cueing what we knew were their goals. Now, that's one kind of evidence, and there are a couple of other kinds of evidence. How automatic is this? Well, we did the same thing with dreams. That is, we didn't play tapes continuously, but intermittently during the night, we cued goals by playing tapes that gave them a word or a phrase, short phrase, related to one of their goals, or to something we thought was not one of their goals. And the goal-related cues, and then we woke them shortly thereafter and asked what they were dreaming about. And the goal-related cues produced about 3 times as much content related to the cue as was true of the non-goal-related cues. So again, clearly the brain, even while in sleep, and that's presumably pretty automatic then, responding to a cue related to one of the person's individual goals. And then there are a lot of other studies that have been done with distractor stimuli and the Stroop color naming measure and so forth. I can talk about this later if anybody wants to know more details on this, but during the discussion. But the point here is that what we discovered from those studies was that not only do people respond to goal-related cues in this way, and not only does this happen automatically and non-consciously in some cases, but it's also kind of inescapable, in that if you have a cue out there that's related to one of their goals, but they're not supposed to pay any attention to it as far consciously as they know they don't, nonetheless, it slows down their processing of the things they are supposed to be working on, because the brain presumably has given processing priority to this goal-related cue, even though it's irrelevant to what they're trying to do at the moment. And so this process, this current concern-based process of sensitization to cues is a very powerful one. And then let me just make one more kind of point, which is, what good is it and how natural and normal then is daydreaming, including the fanciful parts of it? Well, first of all, I think everybody with an intact brain daydreams. Anna Freud, herself went back into analysis 2 or 3 times in order to rid herself of her daydreams because of her conviction, thanks to her father, that this was an infantile kind of thing, an erotic process that she wanted to rid herself of. She never succeeded, as far as we know. And we hope she didn't, because it made her more creative, I'm sure, as a psychoanalyst. These daydreams have tremendously important functions. They help keep us organized, because when you're doing one thing and your mind isn't 100% engaged with it, what your mind is doing is working over cues related to other goals, and so you keep the whole personal agenda of goals before you and fresh, even while you're focusing on one thing. So and it's a reminder mechanism. Oh yeah, in another hour I've got to be there and there because of this other thing. It's a way of keeping yourself organized, and it's a rehearsal mechanism. It's a review of the past mechanism. You learn from the past through it, and so forth. And so again, I'm going to stop here by just pointing out that there have been some investigators who recently have suggested that there's a relationship between daydreaming, that is fantasy proneness, quote unquote, and psychopathology. And I've looked into this a little bit, and I think it's because of a confounded way of assessing daydreaming. Then I'll stop there.
Dr. Malia Mason is on the faculty of Columbia University. She gives us a chance to hear something about some of the newer research that follows on what we've just been hearing, but also that begins to get literally inside the brain. So her studies have been both behavioral psychology studies and then studies of using brain imagery like fMRI to test some of the hypotheses growing out of the kinds of things that you've just been hearing about.
Thank you. So first I just wanted to acknowledge that it's somewhat surreal to be having a conversation with my intellectual heroes. I almost feel like I'm dreaming or daydreaming right now. But I actually think that the most useful thing would be to explain why I took this topic on as, a research endeavor, because I think it highlights why I think it's important. And the first one was, I guess I think of myself as a psychologist. So, I do brain imaging research, I do behavioral work, but I'm actually really interested in, thinking behavior. How does this happen? And so at some point I kind of looked around me and said, okay, well, I'm surrounded by all these other psychologists who say they study thinking behavior, but for the most part, what they study is problem solving and goal-directed thought. So, they'll bring someone into the lab, they'll give them a chess game, and they'll say, okay, play this chess game. And then, psychologists measure how thought unfolds in relation to, that task. And I guess I thought to myself, how much does that really capture what it is that humans do on a moment-to-moment basis? And my intuition was that, really not very much. And so that was sort of one motivation for going into this. And I think you've articulated this pretty well in some of your work. And then I think the second motivation was, so I have a background in cognitive neuroscience, and so this motivation was sort of, there's a methodological problem in brain imaging studies, and basically it's that if in all of these studies you acquire images of the brain during a baseline period when people aren't doing anything except for lying in the scanner and looking at a fixation cross. And what people were finding is that there was a consistent network of brain regions that were active during those time periods. So across everybody, the brain's recruiting these regions. And everyone's like, why is it? What are these regions doing? And I felt like the obvious answer was that the brain was thinking about things that were not, related to the sensory environment. And so at that point, I think I came across your book on daydreaming, and it was extremely inspirational. And then I sort of came across everyone else's work. But I just wanted to say one thing, and well, maybe I'm going to say more than one thing, but so this network, this network of regions that's active across people. So basically what people find is that this network is active across, it's active unless you give people something difficult to do. So everybody shows recruitment of these regions, and then if they have to engage in something difficult, activity in these regions sort of is attenuated. And so, yes, the network is referred to as the default network. It's thought to be associated with some default state of the brain. And one of the positions I've taken is that, this type of thought is some sort of default mental state. That, daydreaming or mind wandering or thinking about things that are unrelated to the external environment is some default state of the brain. And that, for the most part, we walk around in this state. And then when we're confronted by something that requires our attention, we kind of have to suspend that mode of thought and then engage. And I wrote down a list of things that I thought would be interesting to talk about, not because I necessarily have the expertise, but because I wanted to hear what everyone else had to say about this. One of them was daydreaming content, but I feel like you've addressed this somewhat, but maybe we could talk about it more. Because in my own work, all I've basically shown is that, this network that is extremely active when, you don't give somebody something to do is associated with daydreaming. But that's, not necessarily very helpful. It's very vague. And so I think ideally what, I would like to be able to do is talk about, well, what in particular are people thinking about when you don't give them something to do? Are there daydreaming styles? Do people have a style of daydreaming that they kind of default to whenever they're in an environment that doesn't engage them? I also wrote down adaptive function. So, I have argued that we have this default psychological state that consists of daydreaming. And if that's the case, people always want to know, well, what's adaptive about that? And I think you've said a lot about what might be adaptive about it. So one thing I wrote down here was working on problems across an extended period of time. And I think the other thing is, I'm not sure we necessarily evolved daydreaming as a default mental state because of this reason, but I do think that people tend to use it in sort of a coping manner. So one way I like to think about this is to say, okay, imagine if I couldn't daydream. Imagine if I was stuck on the subway and I was bound to the external environment. I think I would kill myself. So I wrote down perspective memory, but I feel like you've talked about that. So I have a background in social psychology as well, and one of the things that I think it would be interesting to kind of think about is, the extent to which our daydreams involve other people. My impression, based on kind of the limited research I've done on this topic, is that we spend a huge amount of time while we're daydreaming thinking about our interactions with other people. And so I think there might be a specific adaptive problem that's social in nature. And then thought suppression and daydreaming. I think that's really an interesting thing to think about. When we have daydreams that are about, something maybe we should, I just feel like at some point thought suppression, sometimes that becomes a goal to suppress some thought, and then that then, is something that keeps reoccurring in your daydreams. And so I think that's sort of something interesting that maybe the group can talk about at some point. And then the last thing I wanted to say was I think it's really interesting to think about the relationship between attention and awareness and this type of thinking. So one could argue that what fluctuates is not the production of these thoughts, but our ability to attend to these thoughts, that they're sort of always going on in the background, and that what fluctuates is just my ability to kind of tap into those thoughts. And I actually think that by considering the relation, by looking at daydreaming and dreaming together, one might be able to kind of address that question in a better way, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think what you're sort of pointing to is some of the actual practical or clinical uses of daydreaming as well. And that brings us to Dr. Ethel Person. I've mentioned some of her books already and her work on fantasy. I have to say one of the things that's especially intriguing and that I think ties you both together also is the extent to which Dr. Person has called attention to the way daydreams are sometimes shared, sometimes by just a couple, and it forms a pattern of a relationship, but often it gets to be shared by large groups of people, and the pattern of the fantasy content gets shared and can have some significant implications as well. So, Dr. Person.
Yeah, I should start by saying I'm hoarse. I'm going to try to talk to you. I have a different take on fantasy, not a scientific approach, but really one from psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And I'm going to use one of your daydreams and one of my daydreams. Now, daydreamings come as no surprise that some of the theorists of fantasy know wherewith they speak. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to start with one of his fantasies, which I adore. Within the format of my fantasized football games, Poppy Ott emerged as the superstar, the shifty-hipped, clearly clever, broken field runner, and accurate passer. As time passed, the overt motor representation of an imagined game was no longer socially feasible, and he says, I began to draw the game on paper in cartoon form. Can you hear me, or should I have somebody else read this?
You're not smart, so
it's not going to work. Can you hear what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, someone can read it for you if you're going to compromise your ability to say something.
How would you like to read this?
Oh, all right.
Begin with you, and I have a fantasy about me in here, and just keep going.
Okay. Let's see.
And I apologize. I tried hard to get rid of it.
Okay. This is a fantasy of mine. I was not in therapy with Dr. Person. It actually was published in an early book that I wrote on daydreaming.
Absolutely.
Within the format of my fantasized football games, Poppy Ott, who was a character in a children's novel that I used to read, Poppy Ott emerged as the superstar, the shifty, hip, clever, broken field runner, and accurate passer. As time passed, the overt motor representation of an imagined game was no longer socially feasible, and I began to draw the game on paper in a cartoon form. I would visualize an entire league series, drawing significant highlights from each game, occasionally writing out play-by-play accounts of the games, and I would keep statistics on the various achievements of my fantasy players of the games, and in the same way that the newspapers do for running or passing averages. As I grew into adolescence, Poppy Ott, who was supposedly a few years older than I was, grew up too. He left Tutter, Illinois, which is a town he lived in, supposedly, to play professional football. And after some well-documented setbacks, he emerged as the greatest football player of all time on a Boston professional team of my own creation. there was no Boston professional team when I did this. Eventually, they became the Boston Patriots, a pretty good team, but...
They may have read your mind.
Okay. Now, this I'm just quoting now from, again, Dr. Lieberman notes that significant aspects of this poppy-art fantasy were initially inspired by my boyhood readings of children's books which featured poppy-art. Then I borrowed the fictitious personage of Ott from these books and placed Ott into fantasies that continued the narrative mode of the original stories. The fantasies took over where the stories left off. In the original stages of his Ott fantasies, Singer depicted their content in dramatized actions, drawings, or in words. Later he turned to visualizing as the predominant mode in which to realize these fantasies. The fantasies were not unrelated to actual events in Singer's life. For example, they appeared especially frequently during the football season. In all of these ways, by dramatization, drawing, and writing, and by correlation with actual events, Singer drew on resources that reinforced the inner continuity, sequential character, and general credibility of his fantasy experiences. The result was that the entire fantasy sequence settled into a fairly circumscribed pattern. In high school and even into adult life, he would deal with situations that were monotonous or dull by resorting to consciously playing out a particular game in which Poppy-Ott starred. Strangely enough, football also entered, now this is Dr. Person talking for herself. Strangely enough, football also entered into my early life preoccupations, though in a different form. I was born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, where football games were a very big deal. Very early in life, I started going to football games with my friends or with my parents. When I was around 12, I decided it was time for me to have a boyfriend. But I didn't not want to have one who was my age. I concocted a strange event, a kind of fantasy event. I always went to a high school football game, and I knew that there was a perfectly gorgeous linebacker whom I wanted to have some kind of relationship with, though he was obviously some years older than I was. I thought I could correct the situation. What I did was to look him up in the phone book, placed a telephone call, and told him how much I admired his playing. How I picked him, I'm not sure, but I was drawn to him. As it turned out, he was probably as shy as could be, because we began to engage in telephone calls back and forth a couple of times every week. We came to know each other, or at least know each other over the phone. I was having a good time on the telephone, and so was he, and this worked so well, we never talked about meeting, only having these conversations. The next year, I decided that since I was a year older, I could actually meet him. I was not really old enough, so that when I went up to him at the intermission in the football game and was introduced myself, he was astonished. And I think he was embarrassed to be seen with someone so young in comparison with the girlfriends of his teammates. We talked a few more times, but the relationship waned. Nonetheless, it was one of the pivotal and interesting interactions of my early life. It was a safe way to have an intense conversation with an almost grown man when I was too young to have one. I think it turned out to be a good thing for him, or so he told me, insofar as he said he had become much less shy. We parted as friends, spoke to each other several times after that, and all was well. I settled down to keeping my fantasies and not enacting them. Given our early life interests, it's not surprising that both Jerome Singer and I have been interested in writing about fantasy. Whether enacted or not, such fantasies are ubiquitous. Do you want me to go on more?
You don't have to go on.
This is before the days of YouTube.
That's what I was about, yes. Right.
Jerry's been talking about that's killing the fantasy life of the...
Yes. My wife Dorothy and I have just published a book called Imagination and Play in the Electronic Age, and it's mostly about children and about the fact that they have developed these avatars who are made-up characters, alter egos for themselves, and they shoot them out into cyberspace and meet others that way.
would like to say a little more about this because I think that it's an important personal topic for so many people. I think that some people don't talk about their fantasies even when they're in therapy because they're ashamed of their fantasies. And I think that's a terrible mistake because I think by drawing on people's fantasies that you really come to know more of their inner life in a way that they're not always willing to talk to you about it. And it's the fear in exposing the fantasy that sometimes make you feel foolishly. Conscious fantasy is therefore much less dwelt in everyday conversation than our dreams. I think we don't take full responsibility for our dreams, and we'll tell people our dreams much more than we're going to talk about our fantasies. I think patients may fail to report fantasies, regarding them as too embarrassing, too revealing, or alternately as irrelevant, but they're eager to tell their dreams. And I say this because I think it's very important
You're quite right.
for therapists to really pull that out because that's really where the juice is. I guess I should say something about Freud. He was the one who really discovered the importance of fantasy in our lives. The way he came upon it led him to emphasize its role in psychopathology rather than in health, which was a mistake. But that was because he really got his knowledge through patients who were suffering and had problems. So I think it took him a long time to get rid of just traumatic memories and get on to memories as that which is so important in every practicing therapist's life when dealing with a patient. You really get the stuff out because you can interpret stuff that is not said in other formats. Now, I guess that's all I really have to say, but I think that for all of us in this room, that adaptive mode of fantasy or the unadaptive mode is very significant in what we do with our patients.
Is what? I'm sorry.
Very significant in how we understand our patients. I would say more, but I can't.
Well, thank you for trying. I'll start with you. Well, I think we might want to now sort of interchange some discussion. I think Dr. Mason has already given us some interesting questions. I have a question that I'd like just quickly for John to answer in terms of one of the things that has been studied in the literature is to what extent are dreams and daydreams the opposite, daydreams being conscious and night dreams being coming at night. Is there more unconsciousness in the reflection of unconscious motivations and problems in the night dreams than in the daydreams? Are there on a different continuum, each of them? And John has done some work looking at that process or at the nature of the actual content by waking people up during the night when they're in REM stages, and has a good deal of information about that, I thought.
Well, I must say that words are the only ways that we really have to communicate to each other, but they are a can of worms. I don't feel the word conscious, unconscious, dreams, any of them are more than a very approximately helpful in any of this. Every single experience we have is in some sense unique. And I really have been in this field all these years. I don't know what it means to be conscious or unconscious. I really don't for a minute. I think nearly all of the things that we call conscious are produced by a brain that has large regions of the brain that are working to produce the set up to those experiences, of which the things we call conscious are just one little fragment at the end. And so I go back just to take off on the plants. The plants have goals, and they engage in random activity. They have phototrophism, they grow towards light. Their roots go towards water. The tendrils of the vine reach out and play around to try and find something to hang on. I don't think it has all the fundamental things that are related to adaptation in human beings. It's not conscious, and it misses all that cognitive stuff, but it's in terms of the adaptive aspects of it. It's the same thing as human beings. And without that, they wouldn't exist.
I would disagree with that, but go ahead.
The thing is what's different about all of this. A large part of it has to do with the human race is survived by working with other people. The things that have made us do what we've accomplished as much as we have is to communicate to other people. We make these noises back and forth, and we have the conversations quite a while before we really know that we understand what somebody else says. Like this particular conversation about consciousness. And that's probably because we have this productive part of our nervous system, which is important for all social communication. That's the foundation of much of our fantasy and thought. And so is a fundamental model. I would start like this. We have stimuli that we encounter in the real world. For any stimulus, there are some, say, 5 options that you could take and what you're going to do in response to them, if they're important stimuli, and that has to do with their relationship to the amygdala and some other parts of it. And then for each response, there's another 5 options of things that might happen if you do this one. Could be any of these things. Some of them are good options, some of them are bad. For all 5, that's already a 25. And those are what I call your goal structures. You're tying these down to what's going to pay off. And the brain, if it's working in an ideal way, is going to give the maximum utility for the decision. And that's foundation for all decision making. We're not ideal choosers of the right thing to do, because we usually engage in the short-term gains, such as winning the next election instead of destroying the country's economy and so on, that sort of thing. The short-term gains are very, very powerful because these tree structures don't survive so well. But that's true for daydreaming, which is your idea in some sense. It's planning. You imagine these things and you imagine the outcomes, and each of these outcomes tails down to things that we've learned from the amygdala, which I see represented in the medial prefrontal cortex, learned things that are good or bad. Just making out with this guy, or all these kinds of things that we've learned are nice and good to do, and they all relate to more fundamental goals, but they are learned values. And the things that activate the best of these learned values are the things that we might then, when we have a chance, actually act on. And that's the daydreaming. And I don't think, at some point, if it looks like it's good, then you get in, you control the thought, and you really follow it out, and you explore it more fully. In the night dreams, I don't think it's an awful lot different, except that in daydreams you may have different starting points. And the regions in the brain in REM sleep may not connect to each other. But I think if you put a pack of noise into a neural system, the system that creates faces is going to create faces. The system that creates names is going to create names. And normally they connect really well. And in the REM sleep they may not create. But we now know that the diurnal rhythm at night reaches your lowest point 2 hours before you normally wake up. Then the brain starts to wake. And 2 hours after that point, if you stay in bed, if we keep you in bed even longer, and your REM sleep adds to that, that's the most active part of your brain you'll ever get. And that's your what I call the super dream, the Saturday morning dream when you sleep late and you have a REM sleep riding on top of the diurnal rhythm. Those are the dreams you tend to remember. And those aren't, they're more vivid, and they're problem related too. They get more related to the things you're going to have to do in the daytime. So it's just that, and when you wake somebody up, by the way, in the lab, those dreams are not so crazy. What we think is actually when you wake them up, they're continuing the dream process. The mind's still working with the stuff that was created in sleep, and it starts to interpret. So there's this person in the dream while you were asleep. You didn't know who that was, and you start to, it must have been my uncle because it was at the beach that in the summer, and that had to be who it was. You're actually still creating the mental process as you move into waking, and then you start. These are attractors that you've got. It has to go into this one or that one or that one. So it never stops. But so they're very closely related. We took people in the waking state and put them interrupted them. And do you remember that study about every 6, 9, 12 minutes? Put them in a dark room, keep them fully awake. Their dreams are their thoughts, because they're fully awake, are just as vivid We measured a very careful visual imagery scale. They're just as intense, and they're just as bizarre as REM dreams. The only difference is, if you're awake, you know it's imagery. And if you're REM, you think it's really happening. That's the only difference. So anyway, that's enough.
Anybody else want to
Yeah, I think what you say is very important from a certain scientific point of view. But I think for a lot of practitioners, me and some of the people here, that we use dreams really to discuss with the patients to really find out what their meaning is and why that dream is coming up then. And so I think it has many different values in very many different circumstances. I think some of the clinicians here will agree with that.
Well, you're more interested in trying to find out about what the person is and what their problems are. You're only interested in understanding the dream as a vehicle to understanding the person, aren't you?
Yes, but that's huge.
Yes, I know, but it's a different goal altogether. I mean, use it, as you say.
Absolutely. That's why I'm making the point that there are two different meanings in terms of how people are interested in this.
Oh, yeah.
And I think many people in this audience are very interested in the dreams of their patients. That's what I think a lot of people deal with, and that's why I wanted to bring that up. And I think you can read into that stuff that is buried and that helps you really figure out what your patients are struggling with, thinking about, that you would otherwise not know.
But you have to know both sides of that coin. I once was in a conference with a therapist who was interpreting the dreams of somebody that used to get into situations and then not be able to move. And they interpreted that as a kind of resistance and a passivity, and they made a lot of personal interpretations about this. Now, if you look at REM sleep, what you do is the brainstem activates the cortex, but it actually inhibits the motor it inhibits the sensory input from your proprioceptive, and it inhibits the motor action, so that your brain actually, the frontal cortex, is moved, run, but you can't move. And some analysts have made the mistake of interpreting that psychoanalytically as some kind of blocking of their ability to deal with world problems, and really it has to do with just the pontine part of the cortex that inhibits the motor. So, pardon?
Yeah. Those illusions of hypnagogia or hypnopompia.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Did you want to add anything?
Well, there are a lot of other ways in which the continuity, the night dreams and daydreams are clearly somewhat different on a number of dimensions, but they also have a tremendous amount of continuity. And one of the indications is that if you relate night dreams to people's goals and daydreams to people's goals, you find that they're both about the same kinds of things. The same goals get reflected in daydreams as get reflected in night dreams. And then there was a fellow whose name escapes me at the moment, Jerry, but he had a chapter in your 1978 book with Ken Pope, Southern California psychiatrist, wish I could remember his name. But anyway, he tracked daydreams across full days, individual people reporting through full days on their daydreams, and found, okay, let me back up just a moment. As probably you all know, or many of you know, at night there is a 90 to 100 minute approximately cycle, and that cycle is one, among other things, of the vividness of the mental content of the dreams. And so REM sleep is one part of that cycle, and it's when dreams seem most vivid. But this fellow whose name escapes me, and I apologize to him for that, found the same kind of a cycle during the day. That is, about every 100 minutes or so, you'd have a peak in vividness of the imagery in daydreaming, and then you'd have it subside, and then it would come back another 100 minutes or so later. And so that very same cycle seems to continue day and night.
It doesn't replicate that much, though. Most it made it a couple of cycles.
Kripke and Sonnenschein.
Yeah, but I don't think it replicated that. There's a few studies on that now.
I can't go any further than what you just said. I don't know.
Well, the rhythm, we've been looking at the rhythm actually with this diurnal rhythm that we found, which was you hit this low point 2 hours before, and then, as I say, if you keep somebody in bed for an extra couple hours, it really is very vivid. And we thought it would continue to go up after you awakened. But there's a third process that seems to inhibit that whole REM thing that kicks in. And whether that cycle you're talking about was now what we would call this third process inhibiting that activation one or not, I don't know. But it's an area of research that we don't, we need to follow it up. We don't really know. And now, those days, the NIH put in 10% of the NIH budget went into dreaming. And now like zero, so we can't do those studies anymore. Right. But I was going to ask a question related to this to you. One of the things that we don't know about night dreaming, it would be nice to know, and daydreaming either, is we don't know any of the sequence of the regions of activation. In perception, we know, you say in visual perception, you start at V1, you move forward as you abstract the response. We don't know whether you're starting in V1, is you start with the visual imagery and then you interpret it as an object. Those dots must be eyes, therefore it must be a face, therefore it must be something. Or if you take the psychoanalytic point of view, he always had started with the drive, the motivation, and created a story. Those are actually two opposing scenarios, and we don't have any data at all to remotely tell them apart. And it's now possible to do it with fMRI. We could now.
I'm not sure if you could do it with fMRI, actually.
Well, you could at least do and see if there's some lawful movement from one region to the other. It may be just back and forth all the time, but you can do it. You can. People that it's very noisy to go into one of these machines. By the way, it's one hell of a noise. But if you do it all the time, you fall asleep real fast, I'm told.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there are some techniques that look at timing issues with respect to when one brain region comes online. So they use something called MEG, but it's only very good at doing
3 or 4
surface.
seconds?
Doing surface areas. It's not very good at medial regions. And so sure, for the visual cortices that would work, but if there are a lot of regions I think that are involved in daydreaming that are kind of on the medial surface, so you can't really assess those, I think. But I think, conceivably there are patients with certain lesions or kind of with damage to certain brain regions, and I think it would be interesting to kind of look at the relationship between, a lesion in some region and kind of what their dreams or daydreams are like. There's a lot of work on patients in a persistent vegetative state, and patients in a persistent vegetative state. So there's a man by the name of Loris, and I think he's German, but I'm not actually sure. But he's done all this really interesting work, and he was able to scan someone using PET, which is slightly different than fMRI, immediately after they lost consciousness. And this individual actually regained consciousness. And what he found was, this regaining of consciousness, so being aware of the environment, but also of yourself, was associated with changes in this network that I would say is involved in, dreaming or daydreaming. And so, I don't know. That's an interesting thing.
Let me open this up really to questions. There's one over there first.
Would you come up to the microphone, please, and identify yourself? We move you so that the people, if there's anyone downstairs, they can see as well.
Hi, I'm Dr. Zafir Azam, one of the resident psychiatry and Canada at White Institute. I had a question from Dr. Mason. You mentioned about daydreaming, for example, in a situation in a train, and it helps us cope with certain situations, and it takes the attention away. And I was thinking, how are the daydreams in that way related to the flashbacks in PTSD while we are doing certain tasks and in an environment we're focused, and all of a sudden we get a flashback and it distracts us, and rather than coping we get more anxious, or there's more. And I don't know, would you consider flashbacks as kind of daydreaming in certain ways, which is not related to the immediate environmental stimuli, or would it be different?
So the way that I feel like I've operationally defined it in my own research, then I would consider a flashback a daydream. So it's sort of like a spontaneous memory of something. And perhaps it's triggered by some external cue. I think, your work looking at current concerns, perhaps they're chronically aware of, on some level, of this thing that they're struggling with, and something in the environment triggers it, and then they have a daydream. But I would say that, as far as my research suggests, that I would say that will qualify as a daydream, and there would be some similarities.
Let me just follow it up a step. I'd agree with that. And what I think also is very important is as we're going through our day and we get some of these fantasies emerging, we have actually done research to show that you temporarily, if it's like a strong visual image, which many PTSD situations are, you are temporarily in another place. You even stop looking. Things happen in front of you, and you don't notice them because your ocular system is caught up in a sense, looking at the daydream. But what that also does is it's like suddenly watching a bad movie that's scary, and you increase the level of anxiety. So you're really trapped very much by the recurrence of these thoughts. And then the follow-up is the extreme anxiety, which often you can't understand it because it happens so surprisingly suddenly. You know that, of course, it's related to your war experience, or you're envisioning some terrible accident or something like that. But it's very much you're essentially moving into another temporary environment, which I think is an important part of what happens with many daydreams. There's another question there.
Yeah, as somebody with PTSD, I would agree with certainly a lot of that. There are issues with hypervigilance and things, and other than, the only way I can see it being daydreaming is in that because you're primed with that kind of hypervigilance, that it then winds up being something to, some kind of avoidance would come in with the concept maybe of daydreaming in terms of, dealing with issues and planning and things like that. But what I was curious about, I'm just a normal civilian here, but I did go back many years later and get my undergraduate degree at Columbia, and I did do some neurology and 1 or 2 graduate courses and that kind of stuff. But I was curious, one of the things I'd read about recently that I thought was fascinating was when they were doing rats, and they were, doing hippocampal, experiments, dealing with memory. And what they were finding was that, if you took the nerves that were, firing during the course of running the maze, that at nighttime during REM, there was an exact replication, but in reverse. And somebody had come up with a theory.
In reverse?
Reverse, exactly. They were played back in reverse order during the dreaming process, starting from the end and then working backwards, was what I had read anyway.
Okay.
But one of the things that somebody I thought had attempted to come up with for a potential application for humans on that was that at the most immediate level, when you get this kind of nerve firing, you wind up having an exact replication of what your experience was that day, which could tie in with the survival mechanism purposes, you review what happened and what might be of import to you in the future, and the brain tries to consolidate that. So, but with this one particular person, whose name I don't recall, had said was, perhaps you start with that immediate level of replaying the day's stimuli, and then, throughout the course, of, further REM sleep, then wind up making it more personalized. And one of the things that would be fascinating, as you were suggesting, and perhaps resolve some of, your question with one another, there's the significance of all this, is if they could make a connection, as you were suggesting, between the different parts of the brain that fire at the different times during the evening, your default network. I don't know how much of that actually applies to what goes on during REM sleep as well. But if you could make the connections, for instance, either during the cycle itself or else during the whole process of an evening's of rest, if you could figure out which areas were exactly firing in association with one another that might have that particular application of the significance of the dreams themselves. If you wind up having, which cognitive centers or, which, especially, perhaps, having woken up and then going back to sleep when things are more active in general, and perhaps having greater associative value. But it seemed like a fascinating concept to try and, to measure which areas of the brain were actually firing in which order, and perhaps if that sequence varies during the cycle of alertness or else during the night itself.
Well, nearly all the consolidation literature process with hippocampal interaction is in non-REM sleep. I don't know this study that you've told me about, but one of my graduate students, Mr. Walmsley, Dr. Walmsley, who's now at in Boston, in Hobson's old lab, she's really like to find some relationship to see how REM sleep is involved in consolidation theory. But let me tell you, it's one big uphill battle. There's very, very little evidence because of it in the mental literature, because the dream sequences are so distorted relative to anything that happened in the waking state. But in non-REM, with the rat, you can walk the right to left direction. I mean, it's the same way as it is in the waking state in non-REM sleep. So all the consolidation literature today that I know of is non-REM. So it's a wish, but I don't see any. I mean, I've been with her. I don't know of any literature that support that.
There's no connection thus far with the early REM periods, with any greater degree of.
Well, they're very short. They're only about 10 minutes.
Okay, but during that time, I mean, just to try and use the rat analogy, is there any connection with perhaps a greater concreteness in some of that stuff? I.e., you're more concrete because you're just literally playing the immediate stimuli of the day, versus later on when it becomes more associative with personal components.
Yeah.
It's a thought, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there is Bob Stickold. I don't know if
there's a what?
Bob Stickold. He's somewhere in Boston. He studies dreaming, but he did this famous study where he basically took people and showed that they incorporated Tetris into their dreams, and so they started to talk about I see shapes moving, and there was sort of a departure from reality, but one would still know that the individual, having known that the individual was playing Tetris all day, one would still be able to recognize, okay, they're playing Tetris in their dreams. And I do think he's got a lot of really interesting work looking at problem solving, and incorporating, things that have happened, in, the previous day into people's dreams. He's done a lot of work showing, yes. And I also actually wanted to throw out this idea of incubation. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this idea, but, this phenomenon where you're either playing, a crossword puzzle and you can't come to the answer, so you put the crossword puzzle down, and then, 2 hours later, you suddenly have it. And I think this happens with dreams too. And there's a kind of a big debate. Is it that you've adopted a strategy, a different strategy at time two, a more optimal strategy, or have you been covertly working on the problem the entire time? And I mean, I know I have woken up in the middle of the night and I realize that I'm like coding a script. I'm particularly likely to notice it if it's in a symbolic language, for example. But I do think that, I don't know.
Well, the third alternative is you've just broken the set.
So I have what? I'm sorry.
You've just broken the set. You've been in a rut all day, and when you go into REM sleep, you break out of that rut that you've been in, and it allows you to see something new that you didn't see before. That's just my take on it. But if there's a consolidation, and we're all interested in this idea. I mean, there's a lot of people who would like to put it this way: is that the underside of it is if you spend all your life, if you're really fascinated about dreams, and they're not worth a damn, and they don't do anything, it's very unsettling. So a lot of us are looking for a reason just because we want to justify what we're doing. But look up Walmsley's website. I'm sure she'll have some stuff on this. But one of my thoughts might be that one of the things you see in the REM sleep is a fair bit of what you could call affect-related or goal-directed stuff, not so much the consolidation of real actions, but possibly an emphasis on things that are significant to you. And I'm thinking down here of amygdala goal-related stuff related to possibly prefrontal cortex. The brain's can do an awful lot of things, and there's nothing coming in. So what's going to select what it's going to do? It's got to be some selective aspect, which is your idea about goals, which I believe plants have too. But I mean, we have them more articulated, and that's what's maybe happening in REM sleep. It's emphasizing what's important as against what's not important. But that's just guessing. We don't really know. We don't have any idea of what other than psychoanalysts who can use them to understand what the person's all about. You tell them the story and it allows you to get insight into somebody because they think, I wasn't responsible for that dream, so I'll tell you about it, and now you can figure out what I'm like. But the actual function of the dream itself, I mean, it may be simply that, we don't have a switch that turns us off and on. And we can't wait till the light comes up like a reptile. We have our nervous system turns on by brainstem-related cycles. And it may be just some way to keep the tonus up of different parts of the cortex. who knows? I mean, if you left all those neurons dead for 12 hours, they're not going to be in great shape in the morning. And it may be that you alternate. But that's all speculative. It's all based on the fact that the Earth turns around once every 24 hours, and we didn't adapt to work equally well in light and in dark. Most organisms are good for one and the other. And maybe this is just what the organism does to get it ready for the waking state. I mean, that's my big speculation.
This is all very interesting. Let me just point out something else that happens in sleep that I think, and in daydreaming to a certain extent, which is that when you're not directing your thoughts, you're not working with trying to achieve a certain goal, your thoughts have a certain kind of freedom. By thoughts, I'm including images, including visual components. And they also have the freedom to merge, so that if you have, for example, several cues operating and you've got images that might be evoked by two or more of them, they can merge, especially at night in dream imagery. And so that and this is, of course, one of the things about overdetermination is that any one image may reflect a number of different influences, and that includes the result of a number of different cues. That happens less extensively, probably, or less often in daydreaming, but it also happens there. In fact, about 20%, by some estimation, about 20% of daydreams are rated as dreamlike by dream researchers. So you get the possibility of fusion and the absence or the reduction of constraints in what you dare to think, because you're not daring in any deliberate way to do it. And so you can get combinations of imaginal properties that do, use John's term, break the set, but they give you the possibility of new combinations of things that probably make creative thought possible, or at least are one of the important things that make creative thoughts possible. And that then gives you another function for both daydreaming and night dreaming. That is, it's a combination of these things. I mean, there are these classical stories, Archimedes stepping into his bathtub. You know the story? His king has just given him an assignment of finding out whether a certain very elaborately sculptured crown is made out of pure gold. But you can't melt this down and weigh it as a block, because it's this piece of art. And so what do you do? And so Archimedes is worrying about this and thinking about it, and afraid that he's not going to satisfy his king's desire, which is dangerous. But he steps into his bathtub, and he notices as he steps in, the bath water rises from one ring to the other. Fortunately, he doesn't clean his bathtub very often. And so the water rises, and he suddenly has this thought, his volume is reflected in the rise in the water. And so now he can measure the volume of this intricately carved crown, or intricately whatever molded crown, and figure out its volume, and then he can figure out whether it's gold by weighing it. Now, that's something that occurred to him at a moment when he had not the slightest intent to think about that crown. But it occurred to him in this way. And then there's the Kekulé.
There are many examples.
There are many examples. I won't regale you with all of them. But they occur at points where the person isn't trying to solve the problem, and it does involve a combination of visual elements that would not ordinarily go together, or associations that would not ordinarily go together. So there's a creative function here.
Yeah, there's a question.
No, I can't.
Okay.
Sort of going off the idea of, yeah, my name's Richard Olin Fisher, and going off that idea of what about daydreams and fantasies in particular when you are using them to try to solve a problem, using daydreams or fantasies in particular as hypothesis testing. Well, what if I said that? Maybe they'll say this, or your fantasy about the football player is like a practice relationship as you move towards being of the age to engage in the actual problem.
Could I respond to that quickly? How much time do we have, by the way? Okay. I'd like to put it into this context. I think that during the day we're constantly having all kinds of thoughts that we play with. Sometimes they're related obviously to our unfulfilled needs. Sometimes they seem less so. But we're doing much more of this than we really are aware of. And people are, we know this now because there are many, many studies of people carrying beepers around with them that go off randomly during the day, and we know the extreme extent of such kinds of random, seemingly random thoughts entering to people's minds. But if you're a person who has some overriding major goal, that is to make a discovery of some kind in physics, then these thoughts will be coming up in various ways. They'll get interrupted by other people. Sometimes, and many writers report they do this, they write down many of the fantasies, even though they later forget they had them, but they've got them in a notebook. But some people are doing this all the time, and if there are people happen to have a particular skill in a field like physics, these random thoughts keep coming up. They often are not thought about very much more, but then they come up again, and then they can be used suddenly. It seems like some muse had appeared and interfered, or it seemed like intuition. But in reality, it's a prepared mind already in a field that then gets a thought which just happens to be the right time to use it. In the case of Archimedes stepping into his bath, he noticed something happening and that he could tie it back in with something he had really spent a lot more time than he may have even been aware of in thinking about. So I think that goes on an awful lot of time. I think in terms of relation to dreams, I happen to be at an age where I do have to go to the bathroom a lot more at night than I would like to. But it's true. I get up more at night, and the result is I remember more dreams. I wish I would write them down, but I haven't done that. But what I've been able to see is an awful lot of my dreams relate really much more to what Freud called the day residue. That triggers an awful lot of what my thoughts are. There are things I know, because I'm pretty sensitive to these things, I know that I thought about them during the day, noticed a face that reminded me of another face, of an old friend or a dead relative or something like that, and it's more likely to come up later in the dream. And sometimes it comes up in a very profound way. Other times it's just a passing feature of the dream. But this day residue, I think, is really more important, I think, than Freud gave it credit for. And he was hoping to find, unconscious drives related in some way to early childhood sexuality. And you can do that only if you look at each dream that's reported to a therapist as a Rorschach, really, in which you get to play over and over again. But in reality, I think that we're constantly preparing ourselves. It depends how important these things are, how we're going to use them later on. And therapy, I think that what we're doing in a subtle way is training patients to be more sensitive to the ongoing stream of their own thoughts and to ways of interpreting them, sometimes perhaps only in the way that's the analyst's particular theoretical position, but often it's ways that can be really helpful to people, and we can learn to use that practically. There's a question there.
This, briefly, you're asking how can you use fantasy in a problem-solving fashion, and I think it can be done, but you have to be very careful about how you do it, because the creative, if you knew how to solve the problem, if you have the tools for solving it consciously, you would just do it. If you want to use fantasy, that means that you're kind of stuck on something.
Well, I almost wondered if it would sort of lead you away from reality. Like, inevitably, as you're creating the fantasy, you're going to edge it towards what you want. And if you take it as sort of a hypothesis testing, you're creating something that you want to happen. And then if you use that as, when you were talking about your idea of every input has 5 possibilities, and from that there are 5 possibilities from that. If you're starting to, through these fantasies that you've constructed, weight your idea toward that. It's almost leading you away from solving it.
Why do you say away? Because what happens is you've got part of the brain the brain may multiplex. It may be doing different things simultaneously, and this underlying pre-fantasy process actually could go on simultaneously or rapidly switching back and forth within fractions of a second. So low-level associations may hit to something that's significant because you've learned it's significant. Even if it's like you got to remember to get the butter to come home tonight. The things that are of significance to you, or you had a fight with your mother or whatever, and that, if it hits that at random, that's going to then spring out, and you'll actually see the rest of the brain start to get active. You'll see activation over all the parts of the brain that would be needed to deal with that in a more realistic way, not fantasy way, likely. Unless you're driving a car and there's nothing you can do. I think it depends if you're in a situation where you can actually realize a solution. If you're driving, like I used to commute for an hour, then there's nothing you do. You go from one thing you can't do anything about to another. But only you stop and go something else because you can't do anything about it. But I think for the most part, you're going to see more of the brain. When something is automatic, the brain can do something very well with only utilizing a small part of brain resources. Just a small part of the brain needs to be done for understanding the words I'm saying. When you get older, you actually have to use more of the brain to do the same kind of thing you did when you're your age. So that's what you have to look forward to. But it's probably true that for any kind of problem, if it's significant, and that's why I think the medial prefrontal cortex starting to it learns what things are significant, the kinds of things you talk about, the actual objects and events. And if something more posterior to that activates that, then it's going to activate larger regions of the brain to give a more realistic solution. You're not going to do an unrealistic solution if it's going to lead you to your death. You do things that help you survive for the most part. I mean, that would be my take.
There's a question back here. What? I'm sorry.
You have to remember that there is this kind of guidance mechanism set up by your goal structure. And if you're trying to solve an unimportant problem and you have way more important things on your mind, then sure, your fantasy is going to take you in those other directions and away from working on the less important problem. But by and large, you're going to stay on track if it's an important problem.
Yeah.
But track mustn't be pre-designed by you consciously, because then you lose the value, the creative potential of the fantasy. I played for a while with using Loiner's guided affective imagery, and I was amazed at the robustness of the waking dreams, the guided daydreams or waking dreams that you can initiate in a deliberate way, but then you have to give them free rein, and they will work over the person's really important problems, and often come up with interesting solutions in a visual kind of way.
One of the things about how people remember is how differently they remember. I mean, I have friends who are musicians who always have music running in their head. That's very different from what some of us do when we're thinking in words or trying to solve a problem or remembering a past event. So I'm very skeptical of too many overall judgments. I think that you only really know how a person is thinking when they tell you in some real way about the mode of the thought, which may be abstract, it may be pictorial, it may be in words, it may be in stuff just popping up. And I just feel that you never know that with anybody unless you really ask them.
No, that's right.
Yeah. A question back there.
So I wanted to...
You want to identify yourself?
My name's Anur Devate, and I'm a student in cognitive science. And I've actually been I've been hearing attention a few times, which I think is crucial to conscious awareness. The term I sort of wanted to possibly introduce being attentional set as one that maybe could be possibly applied here as something that is sort of both a instantiation of your local goal, so that would be the task you're actually sort of engaged in, as well as your broader goals as defined by both biology, such as, you know, an instinctive desire to pay attention to red, or a need to pay attention to red, motion, things like that, as well as, you know, my mother or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And that thought actually hit me because there was an idea of 3 times as much content generated in dreams. This was a statistic you mentioned, if it was goal related. So I was wondering if we can talk about attentional sets and say daydreaming as things that as thoughts that enter consciousness due to broad attentional sets that might go past your current goal and your current task, and as a result sneak into your conscious awareness, and use this term to both be able to talk about statistics about night dreaming as well as statistics about daydreaming and thoughts entering your head, and also then be able to use this term to talk about how daydreaming or night dreaming could help solve problems, because we say we have a problem and then we move on to something else. We might instantiate that in our attentional set, so we're not engaged in that problem anymore, but our attentional set has instantiated that this is an issue that we wish to direct our attention to, so that then in this sort of diffusive thinking that occurs, your attentional set will capture that when the moment is right and direct it to your consciousness, so you can have that moment of eureka. So I just wanted to sort of, this was a question of the power of such a term, and whether, you know, it would be something that could unite these 3 different aspects of this conversation.
That's a very
Malia,
nice way of
I
stating
think Malia wanted to say
Oh, I'm
something.
not sure if I want to take that on. I mean, I think that sounds brilliant, actually. It does make me think a lot about, so sometimes we start daydreaming precisely when we don't want to be, and I think it happens a lot when we're confronted by some task that we can't actually do. And so I don't know, I saw some links in terms of that. I'm not sure, Jonathan Schooler and Jonathan Smallwood, I'm not sure if you're familiar with their work at all,
yes,
but they have a lot of research looking at, they talk about mind wandering, but essentially they mean daydreaming too, but or maybe we mean mind wandering, but they basically, they look at when people are, they make a distinction between when people are aware that they're mind wandering and when they aren't aware and then they suddenly catch themselves mind wandering. And I actually think it's very important. I think that everything that I've done can be recouched in terms of attention. So again, I said this earlier, but I feel like, you know, I argue that this default network is associated with, you know, producing, I say experiencing these thoughts, but really I think you could talk about this network in terms of, you know, attention and attention fluctuating. My one thing is attention is such a nebulous term. I mean, we throw out, I mean, I'm saying attention, you're saying attention, but I'm like, what do you mean? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think attentional set helps us in some sense. You know, there are people who've tried to narrow it down as sort of biasing networks, and I mean, you know, it gets, as you say, this is a...
Well, what do you mean by it? I mean, I don't know what it means.
Well, I mean,
it's considered a field of study, not a process.
Attentional sets?
Attention is considered as a field of study. It's not a process. It's a word we have that we got from the vernacular, which has very little value in science. This is what I think.
Well, I mean, but attentional sets have a capacity to give us a term to talk about the biases, so that when the competition between stimuli occur, there is a certain biasing, so that not the brightest stimulus is the one that will enter my conscious awareness, because I can bias it, say, for example...
But there are biases that can 30, 40 places where the biases can occur.
Absolutely.
If you're talking about the frontal cortex sort of saying, I want to do this, and then it controls about 3 different things that it can determine how resources more posterior to that will be given priority to process. That would be one kind of attentional set, possibly, but it's not a single thing. It really isn't. We could end up playing a word game here, I'm afraid.
Well, no, I think attentional set is a term that's used for prioritization, processing prioritization in the cognitive stream, I think. And you can think of it probabilistically, biasing, and a probabilistic process. But that's exactly the kind of thing that I meant when I said that the current concern that's set off when you commit to a goal sensitizes you to cues. Attentional set would be another way of saying that. Yeah, and I think that's a very important thing.
Yeah.
So he's been waiting over here. Okay, up to you.
My name is Karen Rude. Dr. Klinger made a differentiation between fanciful daydreaming and maybe you stream of consciousness, or what was the term you used?
Mind wandering.
Okay, which to me seemed quite different. Virginia Woolf described more stream of consciousness, whereas I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had elaborate fantasies, say rehearsing someone's death that I care about, or even like my own funeral or something. And you wonder, what the heck is that about? And they're very elaborate, and you can get very emotional about it. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that differentiation, or I know you've alluded to it a lot in the conversation, but kind of go more into that.
Well, I don't see them as opposites or anything like that. I see mind wandering simply as the process of spontaneous thought that you don't do anything with except that it occurs, and it may be enlightening, but that's not the point of it, or at least not why it started. And then how fanciful that is can vary. So we talk about two different dimensions of thought. And when I originally said I'll accept spontaneous thoughts or fanciful thoughts as daydreaming, I was saying that's how people tend to think of daydreaming, as one or the other or both. But not, I didn't mean to state that these are categories that are different from each other, but rather they're two dimensions that are different from each other. And the same thought, for example, could be spontaneous and very humdrum, or it could be spontaneous and fanciful. And a fanciful thought could be spontaneous, or it could be deliberate. Sometimes, for example, when people are getting ready for a battle, at least in the old days, they would engage in fantasies deliberately and launch themselves into fantasies about the awfulness of the enemy, so that they can work up their level of hostility to the point that they need. Well, I wouldn't define it as mind wandering, but it's a kind of fanciful thought. Or it could be, if it is in fact fanciful, then it could be considered a kind of, certainly a kind of fantasy, and therefore sometimes considered daydreaming. Especially if you let it run. If you don't pre-specify what exactly form it's going to take, but you simply say, I'm going to think about this war and what I will do to my enemy and what that enemy is likely to do to me, and then you let it run. Once you've let it run, it becomes daydreaming.
Do you commit a goal to not think about it? Do you say when you imagine your own death, do you say to yourself, why do I do that? I shouldn't do that?
No.
Okay.
Right. But it seems different to me from, there's so-and-so, makes me think about the book I need to get from the library. It's a much more elaborate experience and has a lot of emotion.
It is, and we know a lot.
It's emotional.
Yeah.
And that's really what it's about.
Yeah.
And that comes then sets the frame for it.
We know a lot less.
I think that's important.
Sorry. We know a lot less about this fancifulness dimension of thought flow, I think, than we know about the sequencing and mind wandering and so forth. And so that's a research area ripe for work, except it's hard to get at.
It depends on your profession. If you're a psychoanalyst or a psychiatrist or a therapist, you're very interested.
Interested, yes. I'm thinking in terms of systematic quantitative research. There's a lot less on it.
In some ways, it becomes a systematic research because you tie things to what that person is about. So it may not be scientific from your point of view, but it's critical in what most of us, or many of us in this room, actually do.
Clinical knowledge, yes.
There's a question.
No, it's not just clinical is too small a word, because there are therapists who have it and therapists who don't have it. I mean, it's an emotional connection with somebody, with what somebody is saying to you, that you're not just playing with the words, but you're playing with what you feel is going on in them emotionally. That gets you there.
Right.
Michael Sachs. I'm a retired attorney, and I'm also a member of the board of the New York Psychoanalytic Foundation. And really, my comment is directed to the practical aspects, I think, specifically of daydreaming. And I haven't been able to get one aspect of Dr. Singer's football fantasy out of my mind. And if I understood it correctly, not only did you create the games, have players on the games, but in effect, you began to rank teams, rank players, and almost begin to keep records.
Right, exactly.
And to me, that in a way goes beyond the issue of it being a goal, but basically exercising a skill, perhaps a human skill that we need, and at the same time, perhaps an individual way of the way you ultimately approach your own work. The other practical thing that I've got in mind is the idea that isn't a lot of our daydreaming, in a way, gaming. In other words, we're thinking about things that are likely to come up in our lives, and we're working them through, and we're presenting ourselves with different scenarios. And the question there is whether or not, is that really daydreaming, or is that just thinking?
Well, I would have to say that we're talking really about thinking, and daydreaming is one sort of feature of ongoing thought sometime. But I think that human beings generally can stay focused on a real problem only for very limited amounts of time, particularly if its problem has abstract properties, like a mathematical problem or a money problem or something like that. You can stay focused on it only for very limited periods of time, and then you find you drift away. It's very difficult form of thinking. So I think that it's the daydream is really it's a default state in a way when you've reached a certain limit of how much you can think about one very specific thing or one scene in front of you. To follow this up in terms of your reference to my fantasy, I have to say that I didn't limit this to just football. I had a whole different set of characters in baseball. And I did the same thing with the leagues. At a certain point, though, I had a game. Someone gave me a little mechanical game, not computerized at all, but nothing like that existed then. But it was a little game that so I could involve my friends, and we all made up league teams. We had a kind of a group fantasy, but we actually played it out as the game, which and with leagues and scores, and made up all kinds of teams with funny names, things of that sort. So the fantasy, can have its element of reaching out into some sort of reality.
That's the way I generally understand them.
Yeah.
Fantasy football is a tremendous industry right now.
Right. Yeah, I should have stuck in that business. Okay, sure. Okay.
I'm Mark Fleshner. I wanted to say first that I want to congratulate Dr. Person for being way ahead of your time. When you described what you did with that football player, I was wondering if you ever found out from him how he was imagining you before he met you. And the reason I bring that up is I'm hearing a lot today about people doing exactly what you did. It seems to be much more common now. People either through telephone, phone sex lines, or the internet making up whole identities about themselves, changing their careers from an attorney to a travel writer, changing their weight, changing their name, changing their religion, all kinds of things. Sometimes creating a kind of stable identity that they then use with different people, but sometimes it's a kind of co-created daydream, which I think is kind of what you did with this man. And what I'm often amazed at is that even when people know that they're making up a lot of the characteristics of their identity, they usually presume that the other person is not. I think it happens over and over. I don't know, it could just be the wish that that's the case, but I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about that.
I think in general you're right.
Yeah.
I think this was very early in my life, and that what I was suggesting was useful for him. And so that's how we had this connection till we actually met.
And did he tell you how old did he think you were before?
Absolutely not.
I actually have some friends who study kind of internet dating, and so they don't actually look at how people create this false kind of identity, but they look at kind of how people become really bad at assessing the likelihood that they're going to meet someone that they actually like. And so people spend an enormous amount of time like on MySpace, on Facebook, talking to these people and kind of thinking, oh, I've got a million options. Look at all the pages I have to go through. And then, for a cup of coffee with somebody who they don't like. So they totally, they've had an experience in the world and they disregard that experience and they believe what they want to believe. And I think the internet is kind of ripe for kind of contributing to that and, letting people fantasize about, oh, my options are fantastic, when actually they're not,
But sometimes they are.
Well, let's talk afterwards.
It's like being a gambler. If you're a gambler, you sometimes lose and you sometimes win.
Well, and in the moment, I think they find it really rewarding, like they really enjoy doing it, but to the extent to which it actually maybe is successful as a partner finding strategy.
Do you know how many marriages have come about?
I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm just saying people spend a lot of time. I mean, research has shown that people spend a whole lot of time on these internet sites for a cup of coffee.
Yeah, all right.
That are really eager, so can we do one and then two and then that's really it? And I wanted to, before anybody else walks out of here, let you know that these people's books are for sale right on this floor, right outside this room. So, yes.
Hi, I'm Penny Ellen Burkles. I am a returning student, and neuroscience is, it's an aspiration, which I may or may not make. I had the good fortune to be a laboratory assistant in the little lab that had been semi-vacated by Dr. Antrobus last spring, and I admired your paintings, but I did not like the plants that were not tended to after you left. My question, preceded by the comment, is that the difference I distinguish between daydreaming and REM sleep, night dreaming, is the lack of selective attention. And the attention is not there because we don't have any incoming stimuli that we really have to process. And I was wondering if anybody has done any work with fMRIs to look at the difference in the prefrontal, frontal lobes, and anywhere else in terms of activation between conscious daydreaming, where we do have to attend to incoming stimuli, and night dreaming, where our frontal lobes can just be in a Z zone.
Well, there's been very little work. The only work that I know of is Braun's work, B-R-A-U-N, 1989, 90, I guess. And he's just done the first. I mean, it was very hard to keep somebody in the machine. Actually, used PET, I think. Yeah, so it's very early REM sleep. It's not very typical of the later REM sleep, and it doesn't get the early morning stuff that's really interesting to me. And his major finding, he had the controls before and after, and I don't know that he measured fantasy particularly, but in the waking state, the control states. But his major finding was that the regions of the cortex that are activated in REM sleep they're just not interconnected as well as they are in the waking state, which was something I started with earlier. So it allows the one part of the brain to say, "That's a girl," but it was my brother, because the regions don't talk to each other. They don't constrain each other as well as presumably they do in fantasy. But I want to add, I'm a miserable skeptic in all of this stuff, so I hope I don't give too much of that to you. But there's a problem in all of this discussion that we're using words that were invented before any of psychology and science was around. We're using words that came to us in the vernacular. And they have a massive order of crudity that is not suitable for any serious discussion here as far as I'm concerned. All these different classes, there are far more classes than we begin to talk about. We are trying to dump things into words that were invented 300, 400, 500 years ago. We know a lot more about processes now. You have to look at the detail of these processes and the words, consciousness and so on. There's no such thing as just conscious or not. You know, it's a field of study. There's lots of kinds of consciousness. The things you can stick into words, the things you can say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to hold on to it. What does it mean to be conscious? We can't answer these questions until we have more detailed measures, and we do in the lab, but it's hard for us in this venue to communicate what we mean by all of these processes. But I think that interconnectedness is a piece of it. And I think also, again, the REM sleep is one kind of activation with a knockout of the motor system and the proprioceptive input and a wild fantasy, and you believe it. But the REM sleep, the dreams that most of us are talking about are the late morning dreams, which are another source of activation, which does not include that inhibition. And then you begin to look at your dream and see and talk about it, and that's where the lucid dreams come in. You can actually try and maneuver your dreams, which is what you people have been saying only occurs in your fantasy. You can do it in dreams too. So you've got, as more and more regions of the brain become active, say around 8 in the morning, you stay in bed that long, then you can do other things. Your dreams change in their quality. So there's not just one kind of night dreaming. There's lots of kinds. I don't know if that helps, but...
One last question.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Charlie Garland. I'm not a student, but I'm in the process of writing a book on innovation and innovative thinking. In particular, personal innovation and social innovation, and the applications that are very relevant to everything that you're talking about. So I have about 100 questions, but I'll only ask one, I promise you. You can make it brief by just sort of giving me references to studies or authors or books or what have you to do further research, but I'm really fascinated with one or two things that John said early on with regard to stimulus and response and the complexity of how we deal with the natural process of thinking and adjusting our thinking with regard to stimulus and response. There's a famous quote by Viktor Frankl. I'm not sure how many people know of it, but it was sort of popularized by Stephen Covey in one of his books. It had something to do with, I'll misquote it terribly, but it's something of the order of in between stimulus and response there was a space, and in that space lies our all the world of possibilities for us to control and determine our outcomes. And that has become a fascinating area of further study, such that I am looking into how that space, in fact, can be used for creating a conscious level of a decision to innovate, to create value in the simplest of scenarios. And I'm wondering if you can refer to certain references of the difference between the stimulus that is more a knee-jerk reaction, that which you simply respond to without thinking consciously, rather than the type that you might respond to as a result of a broader context, a broader sort of set of values or principles or passions or things that you've made a decision about in terms of your life's priorities, let's say. So that if you are responding to some stimulus and you might happen to, the thought might be, let's say, a bigoted thought or something where you're politically incorrect by thinking that, but at the same time at a conscious level or a broader level, you would think, wait a minute, that's absolutely not the right way to be thinking. I would much rather respond in a more cerebral, passionate way. Just if you can sort of respond to that in some way. Thank you.
I just want to say, just from the standpoint of clinical work, there's if you look at what clinicians are doing, whether it's in psychoanalysis or Rogerian kind of therapy or many forms of behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, it turns out that what the therapists turn out to be doing, and I've examined that across a lot of different therapies, is training their patients to be doing something along the lines of what you were just suggesting. That is, to be able to get control of the seeming randomness of their thoughts and begin to play with them in various possibilities, and to also use their own imagery capacities to guide their fantasies into a variety of ways, in what I like the term called an attitude toward the possible. What is possible? Initially, it can be rather fantastic, and you see yourself shooting off into space. There's a certain well-known scientist who imagined himself, even as an adolescent, shooting out into space and thinking what it would mean to shoot out in space faster than light. You might guess who that was and he talked often of similar kinds of fantasies, or what he called Denkenversuche or something. Gedankenversuche. Yeah, he's better at German than I am. And so, in a way, we are sometimes unwittingly training our patients to use their capacities for imagery, for imagination, and focusing them in various ways. So sometimes the theory's different and differ enough so that you might lead the patient into a particular direction that might even not be so helpful. But most of the time, I think most therapists are reasonably sensible people, and there is a kind of overlap between the different therapists and in the way they're guiding patients into thinking more systematically about their own capacity to use their natural imagery and natural daydreaming, you might say.
Let me just give a. I know we're out of time, but the let's see, who was it? Yes, the question about drawing on the broad range of your interests and values and so forth versus not. Go look up stuff by Julius Kuhl, that's Kuhl, and Miguel Kazen, Kazen. Kuhl has a theory that mostly is in German, but there are some good English versions of it. And they have a chapter. He has a chapter. Kuhl and another author have a chapter in our Handbook of Motivational Counseling. That's Cox and Klinger edited Handbook of Motivational Counseling. And Kaschke and Kuhl have a chapter in that in which they describe the theory and give you a lot of references to other places. But then if you know Journal of Personality and Social Psychology and the Journal of Experimental General and so forth, Kuhl and Kazen have important empirical work there. And you might also want to look at stuff by Gabriele Oettingen. It's Oettingen. With other authors, mostly Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, on the nature of the daydreaming, the extent to which the person looks just at an imagined end goal, wish-fulfilling kind of thing, versus looking also at the realities in the daydream process and the effect of that on reaching a goal. Those are good places to look.